We have been inspired by their efforts, cheered along with their successes, and cried at their heartbreak. They are not elected to office. They receive no pay for their efforts. And until 1920, they were relegated as second-class citizens who had very few rights under law. Nor could they vote. And yet, each has had their own individual impact upon American history. The First Ladies of the United States of America. The official hostesses of the American executive. For nearly 230 years, these women have spanned a broad spectrum of duties, responsibilities, and causes. From Martha Washington to Michelle Obama. Their roles have changed over the years, and each has left her own indelible mark in the fabric of the United States. Although there have been 44 presidents of the United States, there has been a total of 52 First Ladies. Of that number, 11 of these women were officially acting in the role of First Lady. The official title of First Lady originates with Martha Washington, who was better known to her contemporaries as Lady Washington. In the early days of America's first chief executive, Martha Washington hosted dozens of official receptions, dinners, and social events. And she ruled over these official affairs in the temporary executive mansions established in both New York and then in Philadelphia. By the time that John Adams was elected to the office of the President of the United States, the chief executive mansion in Washington, D.C. was just being completed, and the second First Lady of America, Abigail Adams, became the First Lady to occupy what we today commonly refer to as the White House. While Martha Washington set the initial tone for all succeeding First Ladies to follow, each woman has advanced the position, improving her office and expanding her influence. Although it was not uncommon for First Ladies to split their time between their own homes and the Chief Executive Mansion, their influence was still made known. For Abigail Adams, her influence has been recorded for all posterity through a flurry of letters written to her president husband, proving that since the start of the nation, these women held influence and advised the presidents over a broad range of issues and events. However, not every First Lady was the wife of an American president. For those who were widowed or were bachelors when they served as president, other women have filled the position as acting First Lady. When Thomas Jefferson entered office as America's third president of the United States, he was a widower, his wife having died before his election to office. For Jefferson, his daughter Martha stepped up and served as the nation's first acting First Lady. Over nearly 250 years, there have been a total of 11 acting First Ladies. One of the most prolific of all the American First Ladies was Dolly Madison, wife of then-President James Madison. Dolly was known as a sort of peacekeeper between the two political parties. She often held social affairs and hosted both sides simultaneously. A first at the time in American politics. During the War of 1812, when the British troops marched upon the capital, Dolly was instrumental in saving the famous Lansdowne portrait of President George Washington, before abandoning the White House and fleeing the city as British troops torched and burned the White House. When James Monroe ascended to the fifth American presidency, his wife, Elizabeth, became the First Lady. However, due to poor health, Her daughter Eliza carried many of the duties and responsibilities in her mother's stead. Louisa Adams became the First Lady of America when her husband, President John Quincy Adams, became the 6th American President of the United States. Louisa was the first non-American born of the First Ladies, having been born in London, England. This first would not be repeated until 2017, more than 190 years later. On March 4th, 1829, Andrew Jackson was inaugurated as the nation's 7th U.S. President. His wife Rachel had died shortly before his inauguration, and he asked his niece, Emily Donaldson, to step in as acting First Lady of the United States. But a rift between Jackson and his niece turned scandalous, and the relationship turned sour. Jackson's daughter-in-law, Sarah York Jackson, then stepped in as acting First Lady for the rest of Jackson's presidency. By 1838, and the start of the Martin Van Buren presidency, another acting First Lady took charge of the White House. Van Buren's wife had died nearly 20 years prior to his election to office, and he never remarried. His son's wife, Angelica Van Buren, assumed the duties of White House hostess, and thus became the acting First Lady of the United States. Anna Harrison was the wife of William Henry Harrison, who served as the 9th U.S. President. His wife Anna holds a number of distinctions. She was the oldest woman to ever become First Lady, at the age of 65, and the last First Lady to have been born in the British colonies. She is also the shortest serving of all the First Ladies, serving only 31 days before her husband died in office. However, she never served as First Lady and had never entered the White House. Her daughter-in-law, Jane Harrison, stepped in and was acting First Lady for that short term in office. Letitia Tyler was the wife of President John Tyler. She was the Second Lady of the United States until the death of William Henry Harrison. She herself would become the first of the American First Ladies to die while serving in the White House, just a year and a half into her husband's only term. Her daughter-in-law, Priscilla Tyler, then took over as acting First Lady. However, on June 26th of 1844, just 23 months after the death of his first wife Letitia, President Tyler remarried while still in office. His second wife then assumed the mantle of First Lady and relieved Priscilla of the duties of the position. Her lasting effect on the American presidency is that she ordered the tune of Hail to the Chief to be played every time to announce the presence of the President of the United States, which then became standard practice which survives even to this day. On March 4th of 1845, Sarah Polk assumed the position of America's First Lady when her husband, James K. Polk, became the 11th President of the United States. During his tenure in office, Sarah Polk was the President's closest advisor and assistant on many tasks, ranging from speechwriting to policy matters and campaign strategies. Of all the First Ladies of America, none were more reluctant to enter the White House than Margaret Taylor. When her husband Zachary Taylor ran for the office of the presidency, Margaret literally prayed for his defeat. Margaret was in failing health and spent the majority of her time as First Lady in the residence of the White House. Her duties were handled by her daughter, Mary Elizabeth Bliss. But on July 9th of 1850, a little more than a year in office, President Taylor suddenly died of what many have described as cholera. And with the death of the president, Margaret's health further declined. She passed away in 1852. When President Zachary Taylor died, the Second Lady of America ascended to the top spot in the line of succession of America's First Ladies, while her husband, President Millard P. Fillmore, looked after the nation. First Lady Abigail Fillmore looked after the White House. A former teacher, she immediately set out to install a library in the White House. With a $2,000 appropriation from Congress, Abigail worked diligently to build the library with classic works and important volumes of literature, history, and works of science, religion, and politics, and she often invited authors and other notables to the White House. When Franklin Pierce became the 14th President of the United States in 1853, his wife Jane became First Lady. But, unhappy with his election to office, she chose not to attend the inauguration. In fact, she did little in the way of being First Lady, as she suffered from depression after the loss of her 3 children, who all died young. Jane resided in the White House and did little to assist her president husband, and instead left the hostess duties to various female relatives. James Buchanan became the 15th American president and the first to do so as a lifelong bachelor. Without a wife, Buchanan relied heavily upon his niece, Harriet Lane, to fulfill the duties of First Lady. Harriet was popular in social circles and somewhat of a fashion trendsetter with women, who copied her clothing and hairstyles. She advocated social causes and for better Native American living conditions. First Lady Harriet Lane was the predominant model of what has become our modern First Ladies of the United States. Mary Todd Lincoln became the First Lady of the United States when her husband, Abraham, was elected to the 16th presidency in 1861. Mary, born to wealth and privilege, was well educated and very vocal about her thoughts and support of her husband's policies in what is regarded as the most contentious period in American history. During her tenure as First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln worked diligently to refurbish the White House, which was in a state of terrible disrepair. During these efforts, Mary often overspent on the White House decorations and repairs, and was often chastised for her lavish tastes. She was active in accompanying her husband to hospitals to care for the Civil War wounded, and she often visited battlefields with the president. During her time as First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln suffered from numerous headaches and bouts of depression and other physical maladies, as she suffered from the early deaths of Edward and William, 2 of her 4 sons. Although Edward died in 1850, William died in the White House during Lincoln's presidency. Then, on April 14, 1865, Mary was sitting with the president in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., when actor John Wilkes Booth entered the balcony where she and the president were watching the play My American Cousin. Booth then opened fire and shot the president in the back of the head. Abraham Lincoln died the next morning. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Vice President Andrew Johnson ascended to the American presidency, and his wife Eliza Johnson became the First Lady of the United States. Unfortunately, Eliza was in poor health and was unable to assume the duties of the office of the First Lady, and she left these duties to her daughter, Martha Johnson Patterson, for the duration of the Johnsons' time in office. On March 4th of 1869, Julia Grant succeeded Eliza Johnson as the next First Lady of America when her husband Ulysses Grant was elected to the 18th U.S. presidency. In his bid for the presidency, no one appeared to be more happy about his election than was Grant's wife, Julia. She had been a major force in her husband's campaign and his #1 fan. She was a popular hostess with lavish and expensive tastes, and she labored to bring more prominence and power to the office of the First Lady. Julia Grant holds the title of the first of the American First Ladies to ever be recorded on film. Lucy Hayes replaced Julia Grant as the American First Lady when her husband Rutherford B. Hayes was pronounced the winner of a contentious and close election to office. A staunch advocate of the prohibition of alcohol, she was nicknamed Lemonade Lucy. Lucy was the first of the First Ladies to hold a college degree and the first to be widely referred to as the First Lady of the United States. During her tenure, she continued to work to refurbish the White House, which had once again fallen into disrepair. Lucy Rutherford was considered a kind woman who was particularly kind to White House staff and servants. She was also a horticultural buff and did much to further the advancement of the White House greenhouses. She also ordered a new dish set that displayed her love of horticulture. Lucy was a very busy First Lady, making many public appearances and events each day, so much so that she became the first of the First Ladies to maintain an official daily schedule, and she began the annual event of the White House Easter egg hunt, a tradition that survives to this day. The next of the American First Ladies is Lucretia Garfield, the wife of the 20th American President, whom she gave advice on everything from policy to appointments. Yet, her time as First Lady was limited. Lucretia had taken ill and was unable to attend to her social responsibilities for a portion of the Garfield's time in office. Then, while she was recovering in New Jersey from the lingering effects of malaria, her president husband was assassinated in Washington, D.C., just over 7 months into his first term in office. Mary McElroy became the acting First Lady of the United States when her brother Chester Arthur ascended to the 21st American presidency upon the assassination of President Garfield. Arthur's wife, Nell, had died while Arthur was vice president in January of 1880. Aside from being acting First Lady, Mary was also the woman the president entrusted with the raising of his daughter, Ellen Arthur. The next American First Lady was also an acting First Lady. Rose Cleveland was the sister of 22nd President Grover Cleveland in the first half of his first term as president. Cleveland had been a long-term bachelor into his first term in office, and his sister filled in for the next 2 years until her brother began dating Frances Folsom. When Rose left the White House, she entered into education as a teacher and school principal, and began a lesbian relationship that lasted the rest of her life. When 21-year-old Frances Folsom began dating President Arthur, she immediately assumed the duties of acting First Lady. When she married President Cleveland in the White House, she became the youngest First Lady in United States history at just 21 years of age, a record that stands to this day. She was the first to give birth to a child in the White House as First Lady, while her husband served as the 22nd President. He also served as the 24th American President of the United States, and Frances served a full term as First Lady. In between Cleveland's 22nd and 24th presidencies, there was Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd American President, and his wife Caroline became the First Lady of the United States. During her tenure, she continued to be the official hostess of the American executive, and she continued the historical restoration of the White House. Unfortunately, Caroline became ill with tuberculosis and found the duties of her position difficult as she battled the effects of the disease. Sadly, on October 25th of 1892, First Lady Caroline Harrison died while at the White House. For the remainder of Benjamin Harrison's time in office, their daughter Mary McKee assumed the duties of her mother's position. On March 4th of 1897, William McKinley became the 25th President of the United States, and his wife Ida became the First Lady. Unfortunately, Ida was not a well woman. She suffered from deep bouts of grief and depression following the deaths of two of her children, and Ida also had epilepsy, which caused a great deal of trouble for her socially as well as physically. Due to her illnesses, most of the social functions of First Lady were attended by the Second Lady of the United States, Jenny Hobart, wife of then Vice President Garrett. When William McKinley died, his Vice President, Theodore Roosevelt, ascended to the 26th presidency of the United States, and his second wife, Edith, became America's First Lady. First Lady Edith Roosevelt was known to be one of the president's closest of advisors. The couple maintained a regular daily meeting schedule where they discussed the most important of topics, and Edith freely advised her husband. A seemingly endless occurrence, the White House underwent extensive renovations during the Roosevelt presidency, and Edith herself undertook the responsibility of the project and planning. She is responsible for the creation of the Presidential China Collection, and it's being displayed to the public, along with the portraits of America's First Ladies. And it was during this period of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency that the Executive Mansion was first officially referred to as the White House. On March 4th of 1809, William Howard Taft became the 27th American president, and his First Lady was his wife, Helen Taft. Helen is a woman of many firsts. As First Lady, she is reportedly the first to own and drive a car, to smoke cigarettes in public, and was a vocal public proponent of women's suffrage. She was also the first of the American First Ladies to take part in the inaugural parade of the president. Among many other notable accomplishments of this amazing First Lady is her visual legacy to America, as she was the major drive and support of a plan to plant Japanese cherry blossom trees in Washington, D.C. When Woodrow Wilson became the 28th President of the United States on March 4th, 1913, his wife Ellen became our next First Lady. Although born to a slaveholding Georgia family, Ellen worked to improve the living conditions of African Americans in Washington, D.C., and this First Lady and her husband were more reserved and did little in the way of extravagant entertaining, preferring instead to keep things simple and more intimate. Sadly, Ellen took ill with a form of kidney disease and died at the White House in the first week of August in 1914. Her duties were then taken over by her daughter, Margaret Wilson, who was aided in her new duties by cousin Helen Woodrow Bones, until President Wilson remarried in December of 1915. When Woodrow and Edith Bolling married, she became the next First Lady of America. During her tenure in position as First Lady, as the First World War bore on, she set an example of rationing for the entire country to follow. She placed sheep upon the front lawn of the White House to graze, and she donated their wool to the war effort. She traveled to Europe with the president and was present at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I. Near the end of his second term in office, President Woodrow Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke. Edith then became the guardian and gatekeeper to the president. She is believed to have made presidential decisions and to have struggled to keep the president's condition a secret. Historians today argue just how much Edith may have played the part of a de facto president of the United States. Next, Florence Harding stepped into the role of First Lady of the United States in March of 1921, when her husband Warren became the 29th American president. Some have described her as a domineering woman who asserted herself with her president husband, a woman who took to her position with alacrity and pushed the boundaries of accepted female behavior. Florence was the first of the First Ladies to vote, and she was a woman who embraced technology and modern accoutrements. Sadly, this First Lady's tenure ended when, on August 2nd of 1923, President Warren Harding died of a heart attack while on tour in San Francisco, California. When Vice President Calvin Coolidge was sworn into office as the 30th President of the United States, the Second Lady of the nation, Grace Coolidge, became the First Lady of America. For Grace and Calvin, the position of the American executive would be displayed in a more dignified and subtle manner, and Grace became more of a traditional social hostess and less of a modern social reformer. When Calvin Coolidge chose not to seek a second term as president, Herbert Hoover was then elected as the 31st American president, and his wife, Lou Henry Hoover, became the nation's new First Lady. As the Great Depression began and continued to worsen under her husband's tenure as president, Lou Hoover promoted volunteerism and Girl Scouts programs, and she became the first of the First Ladies to make regular use of radio broadcasts on numerous radio programs. The First Lady enjoyed a popularity that her husband did not, and her time in the White House is regarded as positive and influential by modern historians. Our next First Lady of the United States of America did more to change the office of the First Lady than any before her. Eleanor Roosevelt set a new tone of activism, responsibility, and action in the early to mid-20th century, and she began her transformation of the office on March 4th of 1933, when her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States. As the horrible and lingering effects of the Great Depression placed a stranglehold on more than a quarter of the nation's people, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was seen as the savior of America, and Eleanor was seen as a new mother, who much of the country looked to for help. Because the president was stricken with the permanent effects of polio, and though he did much to disguise those effects, he relied on Eleanor to travel the nation, inspect the conditions and situations faced by Americans, and to report back to the White House of her findings. And Eleanor took this responsibility quite seriously. Eleanor was a niece of former President Theodore Roosevelt, and she was a woman from a family of wealth and privilege. Yet her connection to the common man and woman, and her devotion to the care of the nation's children, was unequaled. Immediately upon Franklin's inauguration, Eleanor set out upon a mission to be more than just a hostess of events and the entertainer of guests, which she often left to her daughter or other female staff to do. This First Lady had determined to take action and to matter. She began public speaking appearances and weekly press conferences, and undertook long tours of the nation to inspect the conditions of American families, workers, communities, and social service programs intended to relieve the hunger and want of Americans under the President's New Deal program. She focused on education and healthcare, and advocated in Washington for those who had no voice in the halls of government. She not only reported back to her social reformer husband, she often lectured him and persuaded him to action in areas he may not otherwise have labored. She was as equally supportive of blacks as she was of whites and other minorities, and she advocated for civil rights and anti-lynching legislation and better living conditions and educational services for Black Americans. And she publicly called for an end to segregation. In 1939, when the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to allow the famed black female singer Marian Anderson to perform at a DAR event, Eleanor Roosevelt protested and resigned her membership in the organization in protest. She then set out to arrange a public concert where Anderson could perform. The venue was slated for the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and the concert took place on April 9th of 1939, and thus the entire matter of racial segregation became a public debate fueled by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady was publicly vocal not only in person, but in her weekly radio addresses, her press conferences, and her daily syndicated newspaper column, My Day. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt also advocated for better wages to both men and women regardless of color, and she lobbied for safer workplace conditions, shorter work weeks for manufacturing and for industrial workers. This modern First Lady of America was not shy about publicly disagreeing with her husband's policies on certain matters, such as Japanese-American internment following the Japanese attack on America in December of 1941, or his lack of success with proposed anti-lynching bills. She often clashed openly with legislators and often visited Capitol Hill to advocate for causes, rights, and the American people. She often accepted large gratuities for public speaking venues and then donated the funds to charities and various causes and individuals. During World War II, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt traveled to battle zones and other forward locations abroad to visit with soldiers and meet with the wounded. She advocated for welcoming refugees from war-torn Europe, and she joined with the American Red Cross to provide care packages for soldiers, emergency aid supplies, and other humanitarian efforts. She co-chaired the Civil Defense Organization, promoted the use of women and black Americans in the war effort, and she formally advocated and furthered the training and use of black American pilots and other servicemen and women in the war. Eleanor served in her position as First Lady of America longer than any First Lady before her or after her time in the White House. Her husband had ran for and successfully won 4 terms as president, and Eleanor served in her role for 12 years, from March 1933 until her husband's death on April 12th of 1945. After leaving the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt continued to be a force of change in America and the world. She served 6 years as the chairwoman of the Commission on Human Rights to the United Nations, and then another 6 years as the United States representative to the Human Rights Commission at the United Nations, and then as the chairwoman on the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women for 2 years, until her death on November 7th of 1962 in Manhattan, New York. Eleanor Roosevelt was a remarkable First Lady of modern times. She was the first to address a national political party convention and the first to seek political appointment after leaving the White House. In her lifetime, Eleanor Roosevelt authored several books, penned a daily newspaper column for many years, inked numerous magazine articles, and gave hundreds of interviews, radio broadcasts, and hundreds of press conferences. She enjoyed an immense popularity that is unequaled by any other First Lady, and she is often regarded as the greatest First Lady in the history of the United States. The next First Lady of the United States of America serves as a stark contrast to Eleanor Roosevelt. When Vice President Harry Truman ascended to the presidency, his wife Bess became the First Lady. A simple and non-pretentious woman, Bess disliked the more social and entertaining functions of her position, and she did the absolute minimum when it came to being a hostess. In fact, Bess Truman spent most of her husband's presidency back home in Independence, Missouri. Bess Truman was one of the least engaged of the American First Ladies, and she gave but a small handful of press conferences and interviews. During her husband's presidency, it was determined that the White House was literally falling apart, as pieces and chunks of the building had literally fallen off the structure. All of the previous restorations did little to actually restore the building. Thus, in 1949, it was determined that the White House had to undergo a radical gutting out, and the interior had to be nearly completely rebuilt. Although most preceding First Ladies had chosen to take part in previous restorations, Bess wanted little to do with it. While the project continued on into 1953, President Truman moved into the Blair House, just across from the executive building. Bess Truman was not the most popular of the American First Ladies, nor was she the most active. Yet, she still holds a record. As First Lady, she lived to become the oldest living First Lady in American history, when she died on October 18th, 1982, at the near age of 98. After 20 years of Democratic Party presidents, Dwight D. Eisenhower was inaugurated as the 34th American president on January 20th of 1953. His wife Mamie Eisenhower then became America's First Lady. Mamie also served as a stark contrast to her predecessor, Bess Truman. Mamie was a vivacious woman with a grand smile and a sparkling personality that was said to light up a room. However, she was more of a fashion trendsetter than reformer, and she took great pride in feminine domesticity, and she preferred being more of a supportive housewife. In fact, many of the Leave It to Beaver types of the 1950s had looked to Mamie Eisenhower as their chief role model of American domesticity. During her time in the White House, Mamie was the ultimate social hostess and demure wife of the president, a role she preferred and from which she rarely strayed. Jacqueline Kennedy became the American First Lady when her husband John was inaugurated to the 35th presidency in 1961. Immediately, her popularity had skyrocketed with young families, and especially with women, who all began to copy her in dress, mannerisms, and dialect. Continuing the feminine domesticity of Mamie Eisenhower's time in office, Jackie Kennedy flaunted her femininity and shone a spotlight on her role as wife and executive hostess. However, Jackie Kennedy was a little more outgoing with the press and offered more interviews and press conferences than did her predecessor, Mamie Eisenhower. Aside from her effect on the fad of dress in the early part of the decade, Jackie Kennedy took part in yet another restoration of the White House. This time, the decorations and furnishings of the interior were the primary concern for this First Lady. She effected a change in staffing at the White House to ensure the historical preservation of the furnishings and decorations, ensuring that these treasures would be preserved for generations to come. In 1963, Jackie Kennedy gave birth to a second son while on bed rest in Massachusetts. Not long after the child was born via emergency C-section surgery, the infant died and the First Lady descended into mourning and depression, something experienced by many of her First Lady predecessors. Then, in late November of 1963, the First Lady accompanied the President to Dallas, Texas, to help drum up support for the upcoming campaign for re-election. The presidential motorcade was returning back to Air Force One when shots rang out in Dealey Plaza. The president was shot twice as Jackie sat next to him in the uncovered motor car. The First Lady was spattered with blood as she climbed over the back of the moving limousine convertible to summon Secret Service agents. The famous Zapruder film instantly became not only the center point of the investigation into the assassination of the president, but has become an iconic record of that moment and the desperation of a First Lady in a moment of personal and national crisis. When Vice President Johnson was quickly sworn in on Air Force One as the 36th American president, a blood-splattered, outgoing First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy stood next to Johnson as he took the oath of office. As the nation watched live television footage of the president's widow and children during his state funeral services, The nation grieved with them, and the sympathy for Jackie Kennedy was forever seared into the hearts of America and the world. Lyndon Johnson's wife ascended to the position of American First Lady and quickly undertook to be a much more active First Lady of the United States. She began working with legislators and other agencies to start a city beautification project in Washington, D.C. And then she undertook to begin a nationwide beautification program of the nation's highways to remove billboards and litter and plant flowers and trees. She advocated for the Head Start program, worked to promote civil rights, and she was the first of the First Ladies to have a more modern staff. This First Lady became the first to hold the Bible in her hands during the presidential swearing-in, as her husband took the oath of office for the presidency, a tradition that continues to this day. First Lady Lady Bird Johnson is considered to have been a remarkable and effective First Lady who did it all from social hostessing to activism to campaigning, traveling, and modernizing the office of America's First Lady. When former Vice President Richard Nixon entered into office as the nation's 37th President of the United States, his wife Patricia became the First Lady of America. She immediately set out to promote a number of causes, including volunteerism, employment of the handicapped, and life improvement for handicapped children. And she promoted the creation of more parklands in the nation. And she continued to improve the White House furnishings, art collections, and decorations. She began an arts and entertainment showcase at the White House, and she advocated for women in federal positions. She campaigned for her husband, and was the first of America's Republican First Ladies to address a National Party convention. She was one of the most traveled of all the First Ladies, and the first to visit Africa and China. When President Richard Nixon resigned from the American presidency on August 9th of 1974, Patricia Nixon accompanied her husband from the White House with dignity, grace, and composure, leaving behind a positive and modern legacy as one of America's best First Ladies. When Vice President Gerald R. Ford ascended to the 38th presidency, his wife Betty became America's newest First Lady. Betty Ford became one of the most human and grounded of all presidential spouses. Aside from being vocal in her more liberal support of equal rights, legalized abortion, feminism, gun control, and the other serious topics of the 1970s, she was open about her alcohol addiction, and she was open about her mastectomy for breast cancer in 1974. She founded the Betty Ford Center for Substance Abuse and Addiction and served as the first chairwoman of the board of directors for the center. In 1991, President George H.W. Bush bestowed the Presidential Medal of Freedom upon Betty Ford, who later also received the Congressional Gold Medal in 1998. Despite her short time in the White House, Betty Ford is remembered as one of the nation's top First Ladies. Rosalind Carter became the First Lady of the United States when her husband, Jimmy Carter, was elected to the 39th presidency of the United States. This First Lady was an active member of her husband's advisory team. She sat in on cabinet meetings and offered her thoughts and opinions to her president husband. She was an active supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment and for mental health awareness, for which she testified before Congress. She also traveled extensively, most notably to Latin America and to Southeast Asia to view the refugee crisis. First Lady Rosalind Carter was viewed as an activist First Lady and not the normal executive hostess. She has been described as a tough-as-nails woman hidden behind a beautiful appearance, and she is generally regarded as a very effective First Lady with a high popularity in office that was much greater than what her president husband had enjoyed. Our next First Lady of the United States was just as well known when she entered the White House as was her president husband. Nancy Reagan and her husband Ronald had enjoyed a life of Hollywood celebrity before the future president and First Lady had entered politics. Nancy and Ronnie were both Hollywood actors who appeared in numerous films in the 1940s and 1950s, and both had appeared together in film. After their 1952 marriage, politics became a central focus for Ronald Reagan. When Ronnie served 2 terms as governor of California, Nancy Reagan gained experience as a First Lady. When she entered the White House in January of 1981, she quickly determined that the White House was once again in a state of disrepair, and she personally led a renewed effort to refurbish the White House. And she updated the White House China collection with a nearly 30,000-piece set, which cost nearly $300,000. First Lady Nancy Reagan was often sharply criticized for her lavish tastes, which often seemed crass while the nation was experiencing a serious economic recession. Her expensive designer wardrobe and costly White House refurbishment was criticized for being lavish and out of touch. As a major focus of her endeavors as First Lady, Nancy Reagan focused on the drug epidemic in the United States and began what has popularly come to be known as the Just Say No campaign. Although the campaign had received mixed reviews, she was again sharply criticized as being oblivious to the real causes of the drug use epidemic, and that her overly simplistic campaign approach was weak and useless. During her time as First Lady, Nancy Reagan was harshly criticized for a number of things, yet none of these criticisms were more harsh than that attacking her use of an astrologer to influence her and her president husband's activities, and her overuse of the color red in her wardrobe choices became an endless avenue for further criticisms. Additionally, Nancy Reagan has been described as a harsh First Lady, not known for her gentility or kindness to the White House staff. In the end, First Lady Nancy Reagan is considered to have been a mediocre First Lady of the United States, despite her husband's great popularity as president. When Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush was elected as the 41st President of the United States, the Second Lady of America became the First Lady of the U.S. Barbara Bush's life with George revolved around his political life in Washington, D.C., and she was a politically savvy woman who knew the lay of the land. During her time as First Lady, Barbara Bush began a family literacy initiative and used a radio program to reach her audiences. She appeared in public at pro-literacy campaigns and often read aloud to children in many of the states and cities. As a mother, Barbara Bush would have two notable sons: Jeb Bush, who became the 43rd governor of the state of Florida, and George W. Bush, who became governor of the state of Texas, as well as the 43rd President of the United States. Her work to continue the constant refurbishment of the White House became most notable in her raising funds for the endowment to continue the work. And, in contrast to her predecessor, Barbara Bush was considered one of the most kindest and nicest of the First Ladies by the entire staff at the White House. Our next First Lady of the United States of America has often been compared to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt for both her outspokenness and her energy and participation after leaving the White House. Hillary Rodham Clinton redefined the scope of the office of the First Lady and led with a broad spectrum of interests and issues. She had been a lawyer, advocate, and the First Lady of Arkansas before entering the White House. She was the first of all the First Ladies to have earned a postgraduate degree and to have had a professional career before becoming First Lady. As First Lady, she spoke in favor of equal gender treatment and universal health care. She had an active role in choosing presidential appointees for administration jobs and other federal appointments. And she was the first of the First Ladies to have not only an office in the East Wing of the White House, but in the West Wing as well. First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton also advocated for children and veterans, women's health care concerns, and many other domestic interests. She stood strong and defended her husband and herself, as well as their marriage, during the Lewinsky, Travelgate, and Whitewater scandals. And she continued to fight for the rights and needs of others in America. She became the most traveled First Lady, having traveled to nearly 80 countries, and she was vocal wherever she saw injustices. She had become one of the most criticized of all the American First Ladies, and has been strongly vilified, especially by conservative men, for her outspokenness and activist leanings. In 2000, First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton ran for the federal office of New York State Senator and won her seat in Congress. After serving 2 terms as New York Senator, she ran unsuccessfully for the Democratic Party choice for the U.S. presidency in 2008. But she lost the Democratic nomination to Illinois Senator Barack Obama. Clinton then served as the 67th United States Secretary of State from 2009 to 2013. The first of all the First Ladies to ever serve in a presidential cabinet-level post. Then, in 2016, former Secretary of State, Senator, and First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton achieved another historical first by becoming the first woman to win the nomination of a major political party for the office of President of the United States. The 2016 election became one of the most notorious and divisive of all the presidential campaigns in American history. In the end, Clinton had commanded 48.2% of the popular vote to Donald Trump's 46.1%. Yet, in the end, Trump commanded the majority of delegates by 56.5% to Clinton's 42.2%. Former First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton had come closer to shattering the glass ceiling and becoming the President of the United States than any woman in American history. When the Clintons left the White House, George W. Bush entered as the 43rd American president, and his wife Laura became the next First Lady of America. A former First Lady of Texas, Laura Bush was a school teacher and librarian who advanced the issues of literacy, education, and women's health issues, as well as an international advocacy, the HIV and AIDS awareness programs, and other health issues. And she was the prime motivator for the creation of the National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. Her beauty, demeanor, and intelligence lent an air of grace and dignity to the office of First Lady. And First Lady Laura Bush is often ranked as one of the highest, top-rated First Ladies in United States history. Our last First Lady of America is the first African American First Lady in United States history. Michelle Obama entered the White House in January of 2009 when her husband, Barack Obama, was inaugurated as the 44th President of the United States. A lawyer and advocate, Michelle Obama used her time as First Lady to advocate for public service, for the homeless, and for women's rights and equal pay. She pushed for the arts and education programs, healthier eating, and for greater awareness of the obesity problem in American children. And she advocated for the betterment of American military families. First Lady Michelle Obama also advocated for the rights of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in America, and for the legalization of gay marriage in the United States. Besides being a positive and active campaigner for her husband's presidential ambitions, she also campaigned actively for former First Lady Hillary Clinton in her 2016 bid for the American presidency. In her post-White House years, she has authored books and continued to speak on topics important to her. She was also rumored to be a favorite possible candidate for the 2020 presidency, for which she has repeatedly stated that she would not run. First Lady Michelle Obama is generally held high in the rankings and popularity of all the American First Ladies. In just over 230 years, the position of First Lady of the United States has seen many different women serve in the role, and each has lent their own talents and interests to their positions. Some have chosen the more traditional role as hostess, and many have changed the office and challenged the status quo to become a more involved advocate for the issues and movements of the times, and for the betterment of women in general. And though some of these women have had less success than others, most of America's first ladies have greatly impacted the history of the United States, and each has done so without pay or official title. From Martha Washington to Michelle Obama, this has been the American First Ladies.